It began with an old letter, yellowed with age and scented faintly of cedar. It arrived unexpectedly, tucked inside the pages of an equally ancient ledger my uncle had sent for my perusal. There was no note explaining its purpose, only a fainting scrawl, for Lucian's eyes only. That was me. Lucian Marchand, the youngest and most distant relative of the Marchand family, long estranged from its history. The letter spoke of Birch Hollow Estate, an ancestral home I'd only ever heard whispers about in my childhood. My father had rarely mentioned it, and when he did, it was with a clipped tone, as though simply saying its name left a bad taste in his mouth. Yet here it was in black ink. Birch Hollow waits. Your blood is its key. Return. All answers are owed to you. The cryptic nature of the letter drew me in. I was in my late 20s then, restless and disconnected from my life in the city. My work at a history archive paid the bills, but left me yearning for something tangible, something personal. Here was a breadcrumb leading to my family's past, an invitation too tempting to ignore. The estate was tucked away in the English countryside, hidden in a pocket of woods near a village so small it seemed almost forgotten by time. It was a cold morning when I arrived, the fog hanging low over the fields like a silken shroud. The narrow road leading to the estate felt unnervingly deserted, the kind of path you'd expect to vanish the moment you looked away. When I saw Birch Hollow for the first time, it took my breath away. Its silhouette loomed at the end of a gravel drive, half obscured by overgrown yews. Time had not been kind to its exterior. Ivy crawled hungrily across the stone walls, and the once grand wrought iron gates hung crookily on their hinges. Yet there was something commanding about its presence, as though the house itself were alive, watching me approach. The grounds were vast and untamed. Cracked fountains sat dry amidst waste high grass, and what might once have been a rose garden was now a tangle of brambles. As I stepped onto the flagstone path, I couldn't help but feel the weight of history pressing down on me, a presence both palpable and inexplicable. The interior of Birch Hollow was unexpectedly pristine. A faint scent of lavender oil lingered in the air, mingling with the earthy undertone of old wood. The grand foyer was dominated by a spiraling staircase, its banister carved with intricate designs that seemed almost organic, like twisting vines frozen in time. "Mr. Marchand," came a voice from the shadows. I turned to find a figure emerging from a side corridor. It was an elderly woman, small and wary, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in more than they let on. "You must be Mrs. Henshaw," I said, recalling the name from the letter's enclosure. She nodded curtly. "Your arrival was expected. The house has been kept in order for your return, though it's been some time since anyone truly lived here." Her words carried a peculiar weight, as though she meant far more than she said. I asked her about the letter, but she merely offered me a faint, knowing smile. "There are things in this house that will explain themselves, Mr. Marchand. Though whether you choose to see them, that's another matter. But that first night was restless. The silence of Birch Hollow was absolute, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards or the distant rustle of wind against the windows. My room, though lavishly furnished, felt oppressive, the kind of place that seemed more suited to observing than being inhabited. By morning, my curiosity had gotten the better of me. The house was vast, its layout a disorienting mix of architectural styles that seemed to blend seamlessly into one another. Gothic arches led to neoclassical parlors. Grand libraries gave way to cramped, angular corridors. I began to notice peculiarities in the house's design. Hallways that appeared endless but terminated abruptly, doors that led to nowhere, and windows that seemed to offer views of rooms rather than the outside. It was a labyrinth disguised as a home, a place designed to confuse as much as to awe. My exploration unearthed strange artifacts, an ornate clock frozen at midnight, a locked trunk emitting a faint hum, and, most unsettling of all, a series of portraits in the east wing. They were clearly ancestral, depicting various members of the Marchand family through the ages. Yet, one of the frames was empty, a large, gilded border with no canvas within it. Mrs. Henshaw appeared at my shoulder as I stared at the empty frame. "That," she said softly, "is where the founder of Birch Hollow once hung, but the portrait has been missing for generations." I felt a chill at her words, though I couldn't explain why. "Well, wasn't it replaced?" I asked. Her eyes lingered on the empty frame. "Because it's not missing, Mr. Marchand. It's merely waiting to be found." The first few days in Birch Hollow Estate were spent wandering its halls, attempting to map the house in my mind. It was impossible. The deeper I explored, the more the layout seemed to shift under my feet, a trick of architecture that defied reason. There were rooms tucked into corners where no space should exist, staircases that climbed only to loop back upon themselves, and windows that overlooked nothing but darkness, no matter the time of day. I found myself drawn to the east wing, where the air seemed heavier and the silence more profound. The portraits on the walls seemed to follow me as I walked, their painted eyes gleaming with a life that was too convincing. I had never seen such detail in a work of art. The subtle sheen of sweat on a brow, the faint shimmer of tears in an eye, the ghost of a smile curling at the edges of painted lips. But it was the empty frame that held my gaze the longest. I returned to it each day, compelled by a growing unease I couldn't explain. I could almost feel the absence of its occupant, as though the frame itself mourned the loss. It didn't help that Mrs. Henshaw had taken to hovering nearby whenever I stopped there, her sharp gaze betraying a knowledge she refused to share. One evening, as the last light of day faded, I lingered before the frame, letting my fingers graze the gilded edge. The house was unusually quiet, even for its typical stillness. It was then that I noticed something I hadn't before: faint scratches along the bottom of the frame, almost invisible unless the light struck them, just so. They were deep and uneven, as though something had been dragged from the frame with great force. I turned to Mrs. Henshaw, who had appeared as silently as always. "Who was in this portrait?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Her answer was cryptic, as I had come to expect. "The founder of the estate, but Birch Hollow has its own way of keeping secrets. Some truths reveal themselves only when you are ready to see them." I didn't press her further. Something about the look in her eyes warned me that answers would come at their own peril. That night, I dreamt of Birch Hollow, but it wasn't the Birch Hollow I knew. It was alive, its halls thrumming with an energy I could feel in my bones. I walked through corridors that seemed endless, their walls undulating like the insides of some great creature. Shadows darted at the edges of my vision, always just out of reach. And then I came upon a door. It was massive, carved from a wood so dark it appeared black, with intricate designs that seemed to move under my gaze. My hand reached for the handle, though every part of me screamed to turn back. But as my fingers brushed the cold metal, I woke with a start, my body drenched in sweat. I spent the next day trying to shake the dream, but it clung to me like cobwebs. Everywhere I went, I felt as though the house was watching me, guiding me. Mrs. Henshaw's words haunted me. "Some truths reveal themselves only when you are ready to see them." I wasn't sure I wanted to see them, but I couldn't stop myself from searching. My explorations led me to the library, a grand room filled with towering shelves that stretched so high they disappeared into the gloom above. The scent of old books was intoxicating, and I found myself running my hands over the cracked leather spines, marveling at their age. Many were written in languages I couldn't read, their titles faded into obscurity. Near the back of the library, I discovered a desk covered in dust. On it lay an open journal, its pages brittle and yellowed. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, as though the writer had been racing against time. The house reveals itself in layers, each more treacherous than the last. I have glimpsed the heart of it, and it is not a place meant for mortal eyes. Yet I am drawn to it, as though my very blood calls me forward. There is no escape from its pull. I fear I have already gone too far. The passage ended abruptly, the ink trailing off as though the writer had been interrupted. There was no name, but the handwriting was unmistakably Martian. I stayed up late into the night reading, poring over every book and document I could find. Most were dry accounts of family history, but scattered among them were fragments of something darker, references to an origin, to a foundation laid in blood. The pieces didn't fit together, but they painted a picture of a lineage steeped in secrets, of a house built not just on stone, but on something deeper, something older. As I extinguished my lamp and prepared to sleep, I felt a strange sensation, like a breeze brushing against the back of my neck. I turned sharply, but the room was empty. Still, the feeling lingered, a weight pressing down on me, as though the house was waiting for something. When I finally drifted into an easy sleep, the dream returned. The black door loomed before me again, its carvings alive with writhing forms. This time I opened it. The air inside the door was colder than I expected, the kind of cold that clings to your skin and makes your breath feel heavy. In my dream, I had stepped through without hesitation, but now that the door stood before me in reality, I faltered. The memory of its intricate carvings, grotesque shapes twisting and coiling into incomprehensible patterns, was enough to make my stomach churn. I don't remember exactly when I found the door. The east wing had a way of warping time, of making hours vanish as I wandered its halls. The house seemed to want me there, pulling me deeper until I stumbled upon the doorway hidden behind an old armoire. It was just as I'd seen it in my dreams. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the iron handle. For weeks, I'd been plagued by whispers, faint at first but growing louder with each passing day. They echoed in the back of my mind, urging me forward. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling down into darkness. The air was damp and heavy, carrying a faint metallic tang that clung to my tongue. I had brought a lantern, its flame flickering weakly as I began my descent. Each step echoed in the silence, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive blackness below. The staircase seemed endless. I tried to count the steps, but somewhere around 50, I lost track. The deeper I went, the more the walls began to change. The smooth stone gave way to rougher textures, the kind of surface that felt wrong to touch. Slick and uneven, as though carved by no human hand. I wasn't alone. It started with faint movements in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the lantern's light. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the product of too many sleepless nights. But as I descended, the movements grew bolder. Shapes darting out of sight, the soft sound of something scraping against stone. The stairs ended abruptly, opening into a vast chamber that seemed to stretch into infinity. My lantern flickered weakly, its light barely illuminating the space around me. The ground was uneven, littered with jagged stones, and what I could only describe as relics. Broken statues, fragments of carvings, and objects whose purpose I couldn't even begin to guess. At the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, its surface covered in strange symbols that seemed to shift under my gaze. Resting atop it was a book, its cover blackened and worn, as though it had been scorched by fire. I approached cautiously, the whispers in my mind growing louder with each step. The book was warm to the touch, almost alive. Its pages were filled with spidery handwriting, the ink faint and uneven. I couldn't understand the language, but the illustrations were unmistakable. Diagrams of bodies twisted into impossible shapes, rituals that defied logic, and what looked like blueprints for the very house I stood in. One illustration caught my eye, a depiction of a door eerily similar to the one I had passed through. Beneath it was a phrase written in jagged letters. "The foundation calls." The lantern's flame sputtered, and for a brief moment, the room was plunged into total darkness. When the light returned, I wasn't alone. A figure stood at the edge of the lantern's glow, its form shrouded in tattered fabric. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze fixed on me, its presence heavy and suffocating. My mouth went dry, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, though the sound barely escaped my lips. The figure tilted its head, a slow and deliberate motion that sent a shiver down my spine. It raised an arm, its movements jerky and unnatural, and pointed to the book in my hands. I staggered back, nearly dropping the lantern. "What do you want from me?" It didn't answer, but the whispering in my mind grew deafening. Words I couldn't understand filled my thoughts, their meaning elusive yet overwhelming. It wasn't until I felt the cold press of stone against my back that I realized I had retreated as far as I could. The figure took a step forward, then another, closing the distance between us. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to obey. And then it stopped, its shrouded form dissolving into the shadows as though it had never been there at all. I didn't wait to see if it would return. Clutching the book tightly to my chest, I stumbled back up the staircase, the sound of my frantic breaths echoing in the suffocating silence. When I finally emerged into the east wing, the house seemed to shift around me, its hallways darker and more oppressive than before. The whispers had stopped, but the weight of their presence lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had taken something I wasn't meant to, that I had crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. The book sat on my desk, its warped cover glistening faintly in the lamplight. I hadn't dared open it since escaping the chamber, but its presence felt like a physical weight, pressing down on me. The whispers had returned, faint and insidious, threading through my thoughts and twisting my sense of reality. Sleep had become impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure from the chamber, its shrouded form etched into my mind. Its jerky, unnatural movements replayed in endless loops, and I woke gasping, drenched in sweat. The house, too, seemed alive in ways it hadn't before. The walls groaned softly, and faint footsteps echoed in hallways I knew were empty. Mrs. Henshaw appeared more frequently now, her sharp eyes narrowing as they flicked toward the book. "You've opened the wrong door," she said one morning, her voice devoid of its usual cryptic calm. "What does that mean?" I asked, my frustration boiling over. "You've known something was wrong with this house all along, haven't you? What is it hiding?" Her lips tightened, but she didn't answer. Instead, she walked to the window, staring out at the overgrown grounds with an expression that bordered on sorrow. "The house doesn't hide anything, Mr. Marchand. It reveals. You simply weren't ready to see." Before I could press her further, she was gone, vanishing into the labyrinthine halls with the silent grace I'd come to expect. It was the book that finally broke my resolve. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The way it seemed to hum faintly, the way its symbols seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. Late one night, with trembling hands, I opened it. The pages unfolded like a map, guiding me deeper into the truth of Birch Hollow. The words, though incomprehensible, seemed to resonate somewhere deep within me, as if I understood them on a level beyond language. The illustrations, however, were unmistakable. One page depicted a sprawling tree, its roots tangled and impossibly vast. At its center was Birch Hollow Estate, its towers and spires extending from the trunk-like branches. The house wasn't simply built on the land. It was the land, its foundation rooted in something ancient and malevolent. Another page showed the figure I'd encountered in the chamber, its shrouded form surrounded by smaller, similarly cloaked figures. Beneath it was a single word written in bold, jagged strokes, custodian. And then there was the final page, a full rendering of the black door. This time its carvings were clearer, more detailed, and they told a story. The images depicted figures standing before the door, each one offering something: a piece of flesh, a vial of blood, an object glowing faintly within a natural light. Sacrifices, it seemed, were required to open the way, but the final image was the one that truly stole my breath. It showed the empty frame in the east wing, but this time, the painting it once held was visible: a man with sharp, angular features, his eyes black as coal, his expression one of quiet menace. At the bottom of the frame were words I recognized immediately: "The foundation calls." I snapped the book shut, my hands shaking. The air in the room felt thicker, heavier, as though the house itself was closing in around me. The next few days passed in a haze. I avoided the east wing entirely, but the house seemed determined to draw me back. Doors that should have led to the west wing now opened into unfamiliar corridors, twisting me back toward the empty frame. No matter how much I resisted, I found myself standing before it again and again, the frame's silent void taunting me. It wasn't long before the dreams returned. Each night, I found myself descending the same spiral staircase, my lantern flickering weakly as I plunged into the darkness. The chamber at the bottom grew more vivid with each dream, its walls lined with impossible carvings that seemed to shift and ready in the dim light. The figure was always there, watching, waiting, its presence a constant reminder of the door I had opened. One night, the dream changed. Instead of the chamber, I found myself in the library, standing before the desk where I had first read the journal. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse with life, and then a voice, low and guttural, spoke from the darkness. "You seek the truth, but the truth is not what you expect." I woke gasping, the words echoing in my mind. The whispers were louder now, no longer faint suggestions but full commands. They urged me to return to the chamber, to take the book with me, to finish what had been started. I tried to resist, but the pull was too strong. Birch Hollow had ensnared me completely, and I knew there was no escaping its grasp. The house guided me. I no longer needed the lantern, nor did I rely on my memory of the estate's layout. Birch Hollow shifted and bent itself to my will, opening doors that should have been locked and revealing corridors I had never seen before. The book was cradled in my arms, its weight heavier now, as though it contained far more than ink and paper. I passed through the east wing, past the empty frame that seemed almost alive with anticipation. The scratches along its base appeared deeper, more jagged, as though something had tried to claw its way out, or in. The whispers were deafening now, not a single voice but a chorus, their words overlapping in a language I still couldn't understand but somehow knew. The armoire moved easily when I pushed it aside, revealing the black door once again. It seemed different this time, its carvings more pronounced, the shapes writhing as though alive. I placed a trembling hand on the iron handle, and the door opened with a groan that reverberated deep into the earth. The spiral staircase seemed steeper than before, its descent endless. The air grew colder with each step, and the walls around me shimmered faintly, as though they were breathing. Shapes moved in the shadows, indistinct but unmistakably alive, their gazes heavy as they followed my progress. When I reached the chamber, it was no longer empty. The pedestal at its center now burned with a faint, otherworldly light, and the symbols etched into its surface seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. The figure was waiting for me, its shrouded form standing impossibly still. It gestured toward the pedestal, a single deliberate movement. I hesitated, the book suddenly feeling like a chain binding me to this place. "What happens if I do this?" I asked, my voice hoarse. The figure did not answer, but the whispers rose to a crescendo, filling my mind with visions of the house above. Birch Hollow's spires pierced the heavens, its roots burrowed deep into the earth, anchoring it to something ancient, something that pulsed with a life far older than humanity. I stepped forward, placing the book on the pedestal. The light flared, blinding me for a moment. When my vision cleared, the figure was gone, replaced by dozens of others, all shrouded, all watching. The chamber began to shake, the carvings on the walls glowing faintly as the ground beneath me cracked and shifted. I stumbled back as a deep, resonant sound filled the air, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the very foundation of the earth. And then I saw it. The empty frame from the east wing now stood before me, impossibly transported into the chamber. But it was no longer empty. The painting had returned, and within its gilded borders was the man I had seen in the book, a man who was no man at all. His face shifted as I stared, the angular features warping into something grotesque and alien. His black eyes seemed to reach out, pulling me toward the frame. The whispers were no longer in my mind, they were coming from the painting itself, 1,000 voices chanting in unison. The foundation calls. The bloodline answers. My body moved against my will, my legs dragging me forward. The closer I got, the more the figure in the painting transformed. Its human form dissolved into something incomprehensible. A mass of writhing limbs, mouths that gaped and screamed, and eyes that saw too much. I stopped inches from the frame, the whispers now a deafening roar. The thing within the painting shifted again, reaching out with a hand that was no hand at all. "You were always meant to return," it said, its voice echoing through the chamber. "You are the final piece." I felt its touch before I could react, a coldness that seeped into my skin and spread through my body like fire. The whispers stopped, replaced by silence so profound it was suffocating. And then I saw. The house wasn't just a house, it was a vessel, a gateway. Its roots stretched beyond the physical, into realms where things like time and space were meaningless. Birch Hollow wasn't built, it was grown, an extension of the thing in the painting. Every brick, every stone, every beam of wood was part of it, and every member of the Marchand bloodline had served its purpose, feeding the house with their lives, their obsessions, their secrets. I was no different. My vision blurred, my body trembling as the thing in the painting consumed me. I wasn't dying, I was becoming. I felt myself unraveling, my consciousness dissolving into something vast and incomprehensible. When I woke, or perhaps when I returned, I was no longer Lucian Marchand. I was part of Birch Hollow, part of its endless halls and twisting staircases, part of its whispers and shadows. I could see the house's secrets now, the generations of Marchands who had come before me, their faces hidden beneath shrouds as they toiled in service of the thing that had always waited at the center. And I knew that one day the house would call again. Another would come, drawn by the whispers, compelled by the empty frame and the weight of their bloodline, because Birch Hollow endures, it grows, it calls, and it always answers.